Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of How Did We Not Know That? I'm Nat,
I'm Jack.
and today I'm excited for Jack's episode. Do you want to tell us what you're going to be talking about?
Yeah, today I'm covering the Opium Wars, and Nat and I did not plan for this large China sequence in the middle of the season, but it just ended up that way. But yeah, it's going to be really interesting. This is a war that I always heard about in light, but I never really looked into it, and I think after this episode, when you hear about the Opium War, you'll have a better understanding about why China has been closed off to trade. They have been a little less prone to trade, which we discovered in Nat's episode. And you'll also probably have a better idea as to some of the other events that come after the Opium War and why that happened, because this really sets the stage for a lot of the other catastrophes that happen in China. The Opium Wars, that's wars plural. So there are two wars, and we're going to start with the first one. And basically, the Opium Wars were a series of conflicts in China from Western imperial powers, mainly Great Britain, in their attempt to open up trade in China. So, for the first Opium War, it's the early 1800s, and Great Britain is not in great financial shape. In the 1800s, they've recently, like 20 years ago, lost the American colonies, which you lost like all that tax revenue, and you lost the cotton production that you get from the Americas, and the tobacco, etc. And they've spent a lot of money on their colonization efforts around the world, and their investment in India is not paying off like they had hoped. They spent a lot of money conquering India, and they wanted to grow cotton there, but you couldn't really grow cotton as well as they were doing in other countries, so it wasn't like successful. So at this time, there are already a lot of European imperialist strongholds around Asia. You have the British in India, the French in Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, and the Dutch in Indonesia, also the Spanish in the Philippines. So it's just like European powers are everywhere around Asia. And so, well before this time, Chinese products were in really high demand in England, such as their silk, porcelain, and a lot of tea. Like the British, it's a stereotype, but they really did love tea. All European countries were interested in trade with China, right? But Great Britain was like really, really liking their products. But on the flip side, China didn't really have a lot of interest for Great Britain's products or like any European products. They just didn't think it was interesting, or they didn't want it. Can't make a trade like that with products. Instead, England has to trade hard silver to get the tea from China. Great Britain starts to look for a solution to that problem, and they discover that although India is not good for growing cotton, it is really good for growing a plant called the opium poppy. So thus we start the opium trade. So opium, which I said comes from this poppy plant, is a highly addictive drug. It forms the base of those really hard drugs like morphine and heroin. Right, so the plan was to get the Chinese addicted to opium so then they would have something to trade and solve the trade deficit. Isn't that terrible? But that's really what they were thinking.
Oh my God, they're literally like, let's give them the most addictive thing. So then,
here's the thing though. In China, the Chinese emperor believed that Western powers were corrupt and they didn't want to trade with them. So they really wanted to strictly restrain trade with foreigners, which, can you blame the guy?
I think they had like a lot of technological advancements too. Like they were doing so much compared to a lot of countries at the time, I think, but they were so isolated, so like people didn't.
Actually, yeah, they had like coal, gunpowder, porcelain, tea, silk. Like, what do you need? So basically, the Qing emperor, who was the emperor at the time, limited trade to something called the Canton system. Canton is in the south of China. So the Canton system, there's one port in the Canton region, which is in Guangdong province, and the port is in Guangzhou, which is the city. So there's only one port. All the foreigners got to go to this port. Also, at this port, the trade between foreigners has to go through licensed Chinese merchants, and it has to be subjected to a lot of government regulation, and they have to pay tax on it. So it's really like heavily scrutinized trade. There were already small amounts of opium that had been in China. They were either grown in China or they had been like smuggled in, but they weren't getting caught. It was just very small amounts. And even with that small amount, the Chinese government recognized that the opium was becoming a really serious social problem. So in the year 1800, it banned both the production and the importation of opium. So
Wow.
it's legal now. And in
Yeah.
1813, they went a step further and outlawed the smoking of opium, and they imposed a punishment of beating offenders 100 times.
Oh my gosh.
They're really like, this opium thing is not the move. So, yeah,
100 times. Yeah, that's not fun.
I know. And so, in response, the British East India Company, which was the company in East India that was producing the opium, they hired private British and American traders to transport the drug to China. And then they had Chinese smugglers bring the opium in from ships that were anchored off the coast of Guangzhou, which is Canton area, like we said.
Mm-hmm.
So in less than 30 years, from 1810 to 1838, opium in China had increased from 4,500 chests, which is like the container for opium, to 40,000. So like
Oh,
almost 10 times.
oh my gosh. And that's not a long time period.
I
Wow.
know. So things are not looking great. And then we get into some conflict between the Chinese and Great Britain. The Chinese emperor is furious about this. So he employs quite a few different officials over the course of time to combat the opium issue. So one of the officials is Lin Zexu, and he's ordered to go down to Canton and destroy all the opium. That's his main job. So in May of 1839, Lin Zexu does a few things to try and combat the trade. First thing he does is he writes a letter to Queen Victoria, and he questions Britain's political support for the trade and the morality of pushing drugs. But it's highly unlikely that she actually got that letter, but he wrote it. So
He's like, please stop.
then he rapidly progresses the enforcement of the ban, and he arrests 1,600 Chinese dealers of opium.
Wow.
But most importantly, he demands that the British chief superintendent of trade in China, whose name was Charles Elliot, hand over all the stocks of opium at Canton, and they were going to give them tea in exchange for the opium. Then they were going to destroy all the opium. They were going to like sell it out, but they wanted all the opium.
Like, this is my personal stash.
Yeah, he's like, good, excellent. The emperor comes in, he's like smoking. Okay, so the British refuse. They're like, no thanks. So Lin Zexu stops all foreign trade, and he confines the foreigners to one area.
Wow.
So, yeah, and then they're quarantined in that area. So the quarantine time period lasts for 6 weeks, and then the merchants finally give in, and they hand over 20,000 chests of opium. But that's not enough. So Lin's troops then go and they destroy all of those chests that they handed over, but then they also seize and destroy opium that was being held on the British ships.
Oh my gosh. Like, they're hiding so much. Jeez.
I know. So the British are not happy about this. And Charles Elliot claims that these ships were in international waters, but Lin claims that they were anchored in and around Chinese lands. So whose side are you on, you know? And then lastly, Lin pressures the Portuguese, who had a colony in nearby Macau, which I did not know, but yeah, they owned Macau, I guess. And did they colonize Macau?
No, I said I didn't know. I didn't know that. Wow. Or
Me
that they were
neither.
in Macau.
Yeah, we should cover that because I have no idea. So he pressures them to expel the uncooperative British from that area and force them to move to the island of Hong Kong. So, I mean, Lin tried really hard. I admire this guy.
Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, British are not happy. And for them, the destruction of opium was a violation of Britain's concepts of trade, because Britain really believes in the concept of free trade, like the government should not get involved in that. And the politicians in Great Britain had been looking for an excuse to expand British imperial interests, so they used the opium incident to act more forcefully with China. They were like looking for a reason to go to war, and then they were like using this as the reason.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. That's sketchy. So they're like, they wouldn't have, it's not like they were so upset about the whole opium situation. Well, like them like stealing all their opium.
Yeah, because they knew it was unethical. I don't even know if opium was like legal in England, so they knew what they were doing. And then a lot of the politicians, when they're making the arguments in court as to whether or not they wanted to go to war with China. A lot of them argued that China was out of touch with civilized nations, which practice free trade. And they also often called the Chinese barbaric, and that they needed to go to China and have a war with them because they were just like savages and barbarians. And
Wow. All right. So so there you go. There you have it.
not great. Okay, so then we have the first Opium War attack. So in June 1840, 16 British warships and opium merchants arrive at Guangzhou and they attack China. And although there were like 50,000 Chinese soldiers to 6,000 British, the British had superior training and technology from all their colonization efforts. So they very quickly started seizing cities and winning battles. It was like, yeah, just really not a chance.
England had like the strongest navy at the time, so a naval attack, like they're gonna win no matter what. Like that's what they do in all these countries that they're colonizing. They attack them through water.
Sea, yeah, and it was like, yeah, even though the gunpowder, like for guns, is from China, the Chinese were still using like spears in the wars, and I guess like not very high quality guns, and the British were using like the best guns.
I see.
So, yeah, it's pretty bad for the Chinese. Lin, our boy Lin Zexu, he gets sent into exile because the emperor is like furious that this is happening. And then lots of Chinese generals are committing suicide because it's so bad they can't defeat the forces. So really sad. And this pattern continues throughout the war, and then they end up capturing several major ports along the coast. Then in 1842, they capture the city of Zhejiang, which allows them to blockade the Yangtze River. And that is like final straw, because once they blockade the Yangtze River, that means that they can't transport food down to other parts of the country anymore. So that's regarded as the last major battle of the First Opium War. And at this point, the Chinese have lost the war and they need to sign a peace treaty. So the treaty they sign is called the Treaty of Nan King. And in August of 1842, the war is officially ended and the Chinese officials are forced to sign the Treaty of Nan King. So this treaty is also the first of what China later refers to as the series of unequal treaties. So they're like,
wow, a series?
Yeah, there's a lot of them. So this is the first of those.
Yikes.
And so here's what the Treaty of Nanking does. It ends the Canton system of trading, and then the treaty provided the British with a few benefits. The first was a deep water port in Hong Kong. Second was monetary composition for all of the opium that was destroyed and reparation for the war. Then they opened 5 new Chinese treaty ports. Yeah, then they also granted everyone extraterritoriality for British citizens. So that means that they were subject to the British, not the Chinese laws.
Extraterritorial.
I think of it like diplomatic immunity, because diplomats get that too.
Yeah, so it's like the same as that, but then they're giving it to like people, like they're just giving it to everyone. And so I'm sure that got abused like crazy,
Definitely. So another thing that was in the treaty was the most favored nation clause, which states that any rights gained by other foreign nations would automatically apply to Great Britain as well. So this allows Westerners to start building churches and spreading Christianity in China. And then on the China side, they got nothing.
Wow. So it's like really interesting because I feel like there's so many, like it's almost like they partly it sounds like a lot of rules that would be set in place if they like colonize the entire country, but it's like I don't know, they did it. Sorry, I'm just like thinking out loud, but it's like they're colonizing it, but without having to set up like the government that has to like rule the country. They're just like getting some of the benefits. You know what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, no, that's a great way to say it. I think this is my friend that I'm going to ask later. She was telling me about this. I didn't even understand like what she was saying, but basically like during this time period, it was like all European powers were like trying to get a bite of China, if that makes sense. And she's like, It's like a dog trying to like bite a beach ball. Like everyone wants a piece of it, but it's like too big, so you can't take it over. So this was like their way of like taking a bite almost.
Yeah. Well, yeah, because you were saying like England wasn't doing, or the UK, Great Britain wasn't doing like well financially at the time. And they knew that there was no way they could like successfully colonize the entire country. So this is just like economically, they're colonizing it, I guess.
This marks the end of the First Opium War. And yeah, not a great time for China. Then we enter the Second Opium War time period. So after the end of the First Opium War in 1842, with the signing of the Treaty of Nan King, Great Britain obviously received a lot of enormous benefits over China, but the British were still unsatisfied. So trade did not expand as much as foreign merchants had hoped, and they continued to blame the Chinese government for this. To be fair, though, the Chinese court did keep finding excuses to not accept foreign diplomats at the capital city of Beijing, and its compliance with the treaties fell far short with Western countries' expectations.
Okay.
Yeah, which anyone who's not familiar with the diplomatic system in China, you have to present your cases to like the high imperial court before they get heard, and that all happens in the north. But
Okay. I didn't.
how do we not know what? But then where am I? Okay. So at this time, the Qing dynasty of China is also still very weakened from the First Opium War. So the British decide that they want to extract even more concessions from China. And this time, France wants a piece of the action.
What?
I know.
Anything.
France was like, let's go. France really wanted to do trade with China, and they were looking for a way in. So they're like, yeah, I'll take that. So in October of 1856, Chinese authorities arrest the Chinese crew of a ship operated by the British. They're Chinese citizens. That's within their rights. It's not against the treaty. But then the British use this as an excuse to start using military forces against China again to open up more trade.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. So France teams up with Britain this time, and they also invite the United States and Russia to get in on it. But both the USA and Russia opted out because they were both recovering from wars. But in 1856, joint French and British forces captured Guangzhou again, which is that port in the south, and they move north towards the capital, Beijing. On the way, they capture a city called Tianjin and get the Treaty of Tianjin signed, which was supposed to be the end of the war, but the treaty never gets ratified. And I didn't know what ratified meant before I looked this up. So ratified is like, it gets signed, but ratified is like, we accept it as the law, and we actually like in response to it. And then in 1860, they finally capture Beijing, and they destroy the Imperial Summer Palace. And then the emperor flees to Manchuria, and they force his brother to sign a new round of unequal treaties.
Oh my gosh.
It's really sad to read about this stuff. The signing of these treaties is referred to as the Convention of Peking because it resulted in the signing of 3 different treaties for Great Britain, France, and the Russian Empire. So Britain and France allowed Russia to join in on the treaty even though they didn't do anything because they wanted more military pressure on China to uphold the treaties and face repercussions if they backed out, because now there's 3 of them.
God, this is awful.
I know. Russia got a free ride from this.
Yeah. And like just the reasoning behind it, like it's really, I don't want to say smart, but like that's strategically, like that sounds like it's a sound plan, but like it's evil. More the merrier to harass.
So this treaty, well, okay, all of the treaties, because there's 3 of them this time, and like collectively, some of the things that they stated were that the territory of Hong Kong is now completely lost to British rule. So that's when Hong Kong gets handed over.
Okay.
And opium is legalized. So after the First Opium War, it still wasn't legalized. But now it's like officially legalized. Then they open up 11 more ports for trade. And then they allow more Christian missionaries to come in to the country. They give Russia a a lot more land in the north. It's, if you look at the map, like before and after this, the second war, like the entire top part of China is just like cut off. It's tons of land that's given to Russia.
Does it ever get returned, or
I don't think so. I think China's still the same size. So it solidified the 1859 Treaty of Nan King, which was the treaty that they signed from the first Opium War. And then it also contains terms from the Treaty of Tianjin, which they had signed but didn't ratify. And that allows Russia, Great Britain, France, and the USA to do trade with China. So then now we go into what are the consequences in China because of the Opium Wars? Because can you imagine?
Like it had been isolated for centuries, and then all of a sudden, like all these countries are coming in, and they do not have good intentions. It sounds like literally like, their first introduction to like dealing with like Western powers is them like force feeding them opioids.
Yeah, opium. Opium.
Yeah.
So after the Opium Wars, opium floods into the country and it continues to undermine the social fabric of society. And then historians believe that the increase in opium flooding into the country and the Qing dynasty's concessions to the French and the British after the Opium Wars contributed to the Taiping Rebellion, which was an event that lasted in China from 1850 to 1864. And this was one of the longest and most bloody civil wars ever in the country. And that was led by Christians who believed it was their sole purpose to overthrow the Qing dynasty. And 20 million people died in that.
Wow.
Yeah. And the Opium Wars are also, oh, go ahead. What'd you say?
Sorry, that just hit me, like 20 million people.
Right?
Oh, holy cow.
It's a huge amount. It's really sad. Yeah, and then the Opium Wars are actually also heavily cited by the Japanese as their reason for industrializing. It's like their reason and need to industrialize and become an imperial power so they don't suffer the way China did at the hands of Europeans.
Wow, that's really interesting. Okay, so they're like looking at what happened in China and they're like, okay, we gotta do something.
Right.
Wow. Okay.
And then, yeah. And China is greatly weakened, of course, after this event, and they start to rethink their relations to the outside world and their need to industrialize and modernize the military, politics, and economic structures. Military, political, and economic structures.
Yeah, so like everything.
Mm-hmm. They're like, wait, what are we doing? The controversy of the Opium Wars. So I do want to include this because although Great Britain claimed that what they were doing was in the name of free trade, it is at the expense of the destruction of Chinese society. And the Opium Wars were really controversial in Europe and America as well. All the countries that took part, like they knew that it was a really controversial war. They knew it was a bad idea and it was driven by money and greed. And I just want to share one of the politicians at the time, his name was William Gladstone. He's an English politician. And his sister had actually become addicted to opium. And so he gave a famous speech on the corruptness of the war saying, quote, "I am not competent to judge how long this war may last, but this I can say, that a war more unjust in its origin, a war more calculated in its progress, to cover this country with permanent disgrace, I do not know and I have not read of," unquote. And then, as we know, Great Britain still went forward with the war, and a few days later he writes, quote, "I am in dread of the judgments of God upon England for our national iniquity." Iniquity?
Inequity?
It's not inequity. Iniquity is like immoral or grossly unfair behavior towards China. So
okay.
I'm in dread of the judge. Yeah. So he says that, unquote.
Wow. So I don't know if that's like better or worse that like I don't know. It's frustrating that like maybe there are a lot of people in those countries that didn't support the war that like knew how evil it was, but then like they're not able to stop it, you know.
Yeah, it doesn't excuse Great Britain or like the European powers at all, but it kind of makes you understand that there's always two sides in history, and it just depends on, I guess, who is in power at the time to make those decisions. And
yeah,
they wanted money more than like being ethical.
I have a question. Like, do you know anything about opium use today in China? Like, is it still a really big issue?
That is a great question. I don't know if it's still legal. I think it's probably still legal, but opium, of course, floods in after the wars. It reaches like peak use. The imports of opium decline, and then they end during the First World War. So opioid abuse like reemerges in the late 1980s in China. But it has declined a lot since the 1800s.
Okay. Wow. But that's gonna affect like the entire society and even the economy, I feel like. I don't know.
Yeah.
And like that's gonna affect the country. Yeah, like you're saying at the beginning of the episode, like this kind of explains like why China in the past has been so like wary of entering trade agreements with countries. Like in the previous episode, like we talked about how they were isolated again after the communist revolution, and yeah, it took them a while to open up their doors, but yeah, like now it makes sense. Like they didn't
Yeah.
have great experiences,
And they don't have to do trade. Actually, I forgot to add
yeah.
to with the opium declining. So opium imports decline, but also China can grow opium. So they start growing their own opium to like, so it's
Wow.
like China didn't need to do trade with people. They're really self-sufficient.
Dude, it's crazy because like the country is so huge and they have so many different like climates and what do you call it, like topography, like I don't know, it's like really beneficial. Like they can, they're so self-sufficient, they can grow anything, produce anything.